It is midday, and so far we've gotten a first hand account of what is happening on the ground in the emotional and mental wellness arena from our guests, Sumaya and Nadia. And they shared what we can look forward to in September, which is Yasmin Mujahid's South African tour. We just concluded a really insightful conversation with Penny Norman on the relevance of action, awareness, and I can't remember what the other A was in terms of what we can do if we recognize we are in a relationship with a narcissist, and how support and healing go hand in hand with each other. We're now going to move on to somatic experiences, which is relating to the body, especially as distinct from the mind. It is true what they say, sometimes we are our own worst enemies. Have you ever wondered why familiar negative feelings or patterns keep resurfacing, regardless of the situation, or why history often repeats itself when it comes to relationship dramas? Oh, excuse me. These answers could be simple, they could be emotional blockages. I'm having a hard time right now. I'm choking on air. But with me on the line is Naeera Abid.
السلام عليكم ورحمة الله
I'm
وبركاته.
so sorry. I was literally just having a meltdown. I'm choking on air, but I am okay now. Okay. Saying, um, sometimes we find that we have these history of emotional dramas that keep surfacing, and the answer could be simple. It could be these emotional blockages in our body that leak out as these negative emotions through trauma or bad life experiences. And sometimes these emotional blockages prevent us from living our best life. When we think of these emotional roadblocks, they can be big or small, they can be unconscious, or they can be conscious. They basically stored in our bodies. And scientists have now compiled more and more evidence than ever before that reveal the intimate relationship between our mind and our body. And we see this with gut health and the gut health's influence over our mental health, but we also see it in the very real physical manifestations of our psychological stress and trauma on the body, like tension, heart palpitations, trembling, particularly trauma that hasn't fully been processed or even acknowledged. So I'm so sorry for my meltdown. I was choking on an air bubble earlier, and I'm going to introduce you properly now, Naeera. You are my girl. With me on A is Naeera Abed, who is a trauma release facilitator and wellness coach. She uses therapy such as craniosacral therapy, TRE, EMA techniques. She's also a hijama detox specialist, as well as a heart math coach. She's a mother of 4 beautiful daughters and a wife for 17 years, and she's exceptionally passionate about her work. And just from the onset, I am a patient, a client of Naira's, and how I was introduced to her work was um, at the beginning of this year or late last year. I'm all about healing, emotional health, physical health, mental health, and I believe that when families do things together, you can really, that's how generational trauma is really broken. Okay. And for me, it was imperative for me to work at healing on the ground at a holistic level with my children, with my husband. It's something that I'm, very I care very deeply for. And I had a session with Naira, actually the five of us, my 3 kids, my husband and I had a few sessions with Naira doing TRE. It was quite transformative, I have to say. My son was slightly distracting. And then once we got into the work, we realized that we needed to work separately. Okay. My husband and I needed to work independently, from our children. And Naira said, teach yourself first. Because if you can regulate your nervous system, it will immediately impact your children. And now I've taken this thinking into my own work. And I see that when you have moms and women that are grounded in their own selves, for them to effect change in their family, which ultimately affects change generations and generations on, you see the difference there as opposed to working with the children in isolation. So, Naira, welcome. I'm so happy to have you. I'm sorry I choked up on air, like literally choked up.
It's okay. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Johara, are you okay there? Like taking
I
a
am okay. You know what? I didn't have my water. I was trying to like be like decent on air, but I'm good now. I do have a bit of a tickle in my throat, but if I need water, I'll just grab my water. Naira, we've had these conversations about trauma and people's misunderstanding of trauma. People have a skewed idea of what trauma actually is. How would you explain it in a nutshell for the layman?
Okay, so in short, trauma is a response to a deeply disturbing event, right? So, where does the misconception come in? Trauma is seen out in the world as emotional and mental because that's obviously how it presents itself, right? But actually, trauma starts in the body and it's linked to the brain stem, which is part of the brain designed purely for survival. Okay, so what happens is the protein is released into the fascial system when the brain actually detects the danger, right? And it contracts the body and gets us ready to execute our fight flight mechanism or our response for survival. Okay, so when we don't execute that fight flight mechanism properly, the trauma sits in the body. And all of the information received at the time of the trauma, all of the emotions, the sensations, or basically all the information that goes through your system at the time of trauma then sits in the body. I mean, keep in mind, Jahara, the emotional long-term stress, like living, with a narcissist, like you mentioned earlier, living in a home with um, no consistency, but, living with somebody with bipolar, wondering what's going to happen next, not knowing what to expect later in the day. So that's like living with an emotional abuser, right? And you don't know what the situation is going to be. So the trauma response stays in the body. And because of being constantly in a on a high alert around you. So that's why you stay in that state, right? And in that case, the brainstem continuously reads the fascial system looking for these contractions. And it basically wants to know whether we're still in danger. And I always say this to clients that tightness is danger to the brain. So the minute
Mm.
the contraction's in the body, the brain detects that trauma is still there. And on that note, softness in the fascia is then safety to the brain.
That's really beautiful. You mentioned the nervous system and being activated in a state of fight, flight, or freeze. I'm really interested in nervous system activation. Can you share with us what the relationship is between our nervous system and trauma?
Yes, definitely. So, firstly, it's important to know that there's three parts to our nervous system, right? So, you have the central nervous system, you have the enteric, and you have the autonomic nervous system. So, the autonomic nervous system is really the one responsible for the formation of the trauma response, and that's that fight flight mechanism, right? The problem again is when we're unable to execute that fight flight mechanism properly. We end up with a dysregulated nervous system. And people with a dysregulated nervous system can actually look patterns of avoidance, defensive behavior, very reactive behavior. People that will just react at the,
Mm.
just initially in the conversation, they would just react. And that can be a sign of a dysregulated nervous system, right? So let's go a little further and talk about the vagus nerve. The vagus
Mm.
nerve has two parts, the ventral vagal and the dorsal vagal, right? So the dorsal vagal is the freeze response in the nervous system. It's a deeper state in the nervous system designed for safety, right? And then
Mhm.
you get the ventral vagal state, which is your rest and digest.
Mhm.
Um, if I'm under correction here, the ventral vagal state starts developing in vitro and then continues developing 6 to 8 weeks after birth, right? And
So
in order for that,
are you suggesting, Naira, that even stress in vitro can affect a developing fetus?
exactly, it can start as early as that.
Amazing.
The ventral vagal state needs. So obviously, it's very important what happens in vitro. And after birth, very importantly, after birth, the baby needs to suckle properly and have a connection with the mom for that ventral vagal state to fully develop, right? And I
Yes.
mean, a baby can come from a
And
loving
that's the
home.
system that's responsible for rest and digest. So when we look into polyvagal theory and we use breath work or meditation or humming to activate our polyvagal nerve, we want to activate the part that is going to send our body into a state of rest and digest, which is going to calm us down and activate our parasympathetic nervous system.
Yes, but I mean, you're talking about a baby that could be coming from a very loving home, not a traumatized
Mm,
home, but just have something as simple as a feeding difficulty that will prevent
mm,
the ventral vagal state from developing, right? And in adults, you see that effect. These are the people that can't regulate. You'll find them
yes.
crying excessively or very angry, and they lead to placing behaviors such as OCD, different forms of regulation. Most importantly, these are people that have never developed their ventral vagal state, and we need to bring in a body regulation. And for that, you need safety.
That's amazing. So earlier you spoke about, well, you've been speaking. I love speaking to you because now you're unpacking this
I
so
love speaking
beautifully.
to you.
And I want to understand. Okay, so we've spoken about the vagus nerve and how it's actually um, in vitro, our vagus nerve is being developed, and when babies have problems latching or problem self-soothing, then that can impact them much later on in life in terms of their emotional regulation capacity as adults. Am I right? Okay,
Yes.
now let's talk about this. Wouldn't be perceived as trauma, right? But if we consider what trauma is, okay, being anything that leaves our nervous system activated for a predetermined amount of time without the relevant coping mechanisms to soothe us back to a baseline, right? Because an emotional baseline is something that looks like that. When a person is in activation, their nervous system is basically activated, it's shut up, right? So when we now have a better understanding of what trauma is, that trauma is not necessarily abuse, that trauma is not necessarily violence, hijackings. Trauma is anything that takes us away from that emotional baseline. Okay. And trauma can be that crying baby that has not latched on. Trauma can be a person who is just reactive because they were not given the skills to cope with their emotions or the language to cope with their emotions from the time they were younger in their developmental years. Now can we establish how do our bodies store the big T traumas and the little T traumas? Because you mentioned that uh, ten, uh, tense fascia, tight fascia, will automatically give you an inclination to trauma, and relaxed, loose fascia represents safety and harmony within the body. So when
Yes.
we look at it from that angle, how would we determine how trauma is stored in our bodies?
Um, okay, so what's important to know here, Jahara, is that the big traumas or the bigger experiences or the bigger events in our lives are not the only thing that cause these contractions in the body to form, right? The smaller long term ones, being exposed to unknown territory or being heightened in your nervous system, as we spoke about, they represent themselves in the body just as much as
Mm,
those bigger traumatic events or experiences, right? And again, the storing is because we don't get to properly execute that fight flight. We don't discharge these tension patterns from the body. And that's why movement is so important to continuously release these tension patterns. I mean, we're talking as early as from the time you're born, and that can present itself as massive trauma in the system. I mean, when you talk to people about trauma, they automatically say, I haven't been through anything massive in my life.
mm,
But if you are storing these tension patterns in your body from as early as when you were born, the body is now starting to, it's this trauma is representing itself as a massive trauma in the body, and the
mm,
body is perceiving that, the brain is perceiving it as trauma, right? So movement is very important. I mean, if you can't go for treatment, at least walk, when you're walking, the brain can, it looks at the movement, and it picks up movement as if we are flighting. We're executing the flight mode. If you do brisk walking or really fast walking, it picks up the fight mode, that you're executing that fight mode, and it's a good way to regulate your nervous system, right? Obviously, it's not permanent. To permanently deal with these tension patterns stored in the body, you have to deal with them from where they originated, and that's the brain stem, so nervous system regulation work.
I really want to get into more of that with you, Naira, but it is time for us to take a quick ad break. When we come back, we will find out more about how we can release these tension patterns, inshallah.
Joining hands.
You're doing
Salam
so
Media.
well, Naira.
You okay?
I literally just
Humanity
choked
sets
on
the
like
agenda.
an air bubble or dust, and I could feel like my voice, like my larynx being like pulled up, but I'm good now.
You covered
I'm
it up
talking to
quite well.
Naira. She and the engineer is looking at me. No, I'm talking to Naira.
I
She can
remember
hear me,
when
but
I first met you. I felt that God answered my
can you
call.
hear me,
There was
I
that
can.
Naira?
one
Yeah,
place
she
I
can hear me.
always thought about,
You
and I
mean the
just
other
wanted
people
to
can
be
also hear
there
me?
with
Oh,
you. The place that no eye
that's what you're
has
concerned
ever
about.
seen, the place that no heart has ever perceived. I had a great feeling inside of me that one day I'll be there with you. And now that we're here, feeling so good about all the things that we went through, knowing that God is pleased with us too. It's not a dream, this is so true. Feeling the peace all around, seeing things we can never imagine, hearing the sound of rivers flow, and we know we'll be here forever. The feeling is indescribable, knowing that this is our reward. Do we remember the hard times? Listen to something fresh. Listen to Salam Media.
You're back with me, Jahara Hassama on Salam Media, and with me on air is Naira Abed, who is a TRE facilitator, amongst many other things. And right now, we are speaking about the real physical manifestations of psychological stress and tension patterns on the body. So, Naira, before we went off onto the break, you spoke about these tension patterns that need to be released, even if it's through simple actions like walking. Okay. What are the common markers that people can look out for to detect unprocessed trauma? Because until recently, I didn't realize how trauma can really store itself within our bodies, and not just, like you said, what the perceived idea of trauma is, but these little traumas as well, exposure to things that send our nervous system into activation. What are the long-term effects, and how do we identify them early enough to rectify them?
Okay, so as human beings, we become very good at developing coping mechanisms. That's what we're really good at, right? So
But
even
not
though we
all of them are healthy coping mechanisms.
exactly. That's they're just there to keep us safe, right? So we develop these coping mechanisms, and we know we've been through trauma, and we tend to say, "Look, I'm fine now. I've dealt with it. I'm okay." But then you look at behaviors such as the very same person that says, "I've dealt with it. I'm fine now." You pick up things like excessive eating, smoking weed, sugar cravings. OCD, bipolar, erratic type of behaviors. I mean, one minute I'm okay, the next minute I'm depressed, the next minute I'm angry. So very erratic behavior, right? Let's look at patterns in kids, for example. That's an excellent example because kids don't have access to that fight flight mechanism, right? So they go into freeze, and that's where they develop these ADHD type of behaviors, right? Classroom disruption. They're not doing it on purpose. They actually have a very healthy nervous system that is trying to come out of that state of freeze. So what happens with these kids is they're stuck in what we call a feedback loop, right? The brain keeps reading the body, thinking it's not out of that state of freeze, it's not out of trauma, and that's when it reacts. So we go thinking these kids are just naughty, or the
Mm.
person's just smoking weed out of habit. But what's actually happening is unprocessed trauma is causing that
We
contraction.
seem to have, oh, there we go. We
So
lost you
the
for a
brain,
bit, Naira. Do continue.
sorry. So what's happening is the unprocessed trauma is still stored in the body, and the brainstem keeps searching the fascial system for what we call softening in the body, but it keeps finding these contractions, and that is what the
Mm.
unprocessed trauma is doing. So while you might think I'm
Okay, we seem to have lost Naira, but there we go. We have her back on air.
sorry about that. It's searching for the softening in the body, but what it's actually picking up is contraction in the body. And that's when the unprocessed trauma is causing you to react or to do certain things to try and regulate yourself.
Subhanallah, this is so fascinating. So now we understand that children who are acting out are actually children with really healthy, thriving nervous systems that are just looking for ways to come out of that state of freeze, because children by default don't have the strategies or the appropriate mechanisms to get themselves out of a freeze state. So in this feedback loop, they will just remain stuck in a free state. Now let's move on. Um, what when now you've spoken about children and you've spoken about the free state, and I remember coming to you on my first session and you did a little reading on my ear, right? And we compared the reading of my first session to the reading of like my eighth or 10th session. I can't remember. And it was my I can't remember. Maybe you can explain that a little bit more. But basically, it was my heart rate monitor, and you told me that I had been in a state of freeze for the better part of my life, completely unaware, unbeknownst to me. Here I am thinking I'm doing such phenomenal work in my emotional health, and I was stuck in a freeze. What are some of the long term and short term effects of trauma on our behaviors, on our habits, and on our bodies? You spoke about how we can't look at things at surface level. So, if a child is acting out, that isn't just a naughty child. If somebody is, say, for instance, smoking weed, they're not just doing it, because they're bad. There is an emotional, traumatic aspect that lies beneath the surface. Can you unpack what it looks like holistically when we are dealing with trauma and how it impacts our behaviors in the long run?
Okay, so Johara, unprocessed trauma drives us to compensate and to try and regulate, right? Which is what you and I discussed when I first saw you. It's not the best form of regulation. It's just a behavior that we pick up over time that helps us to feel safe. It helps the brain to think we're in safety, right? So safety is important to mention here as to why we have these habits. That's what the brainstem is craving, something to settle that very heightened nervous system or to excite the very shutdown or frozen nervous system, right? And that all depends which state you're in. You're either in shutdown or you're in a very heightened state. But these are habits that we pick up over time to try and regulate our nervous system, right? So, OCD, for example, once the brain registers the actual patterning, when we're talking about, say, excessive washing hands is a good example, locking doors. I mean, I had a client who was in a burglary, and this client was obviously in a very dangerous situation and could not regulate herself. And in the years after that, she would continuously lock the door, unlock the door, lock the door. And these patterns were considered disruptive. People would tell her, you obsessed with locking and unlocking the door. But actually, what it's doing is it's bringing safety for that person's brain, right? Also, look at hyperactivity in kids. Again, nervous system trying to bring itself out of freeze. The brain is trying its best to regulate. So, long term, short term effects, we pick up these patterns in a way to survive, which is exactly what you and I chatted about. You picked up certain behaviors for your brain to feel safe, not knowing that it's actually in a state of freeze and needs to excite that nervous system, right? So we don't have a full, complete outlet for the trauma. And because that requires safety, and that's exactly what the treatment does. Takes you into safety, allowing the trauma to release itself so you don't pick up these long-term effects and behaviors to try and regulate your own nervous system, if that makes
Because
sense.
ultimately, when it comes to the brain, right, the brain just detects patterns, and anything that is predictable is considered safe, even if those predictable patterns are inevitably destructive or unhealthy or unsafe. And like our previous guest mentioned, getting out of abusive relationships or women in destructive relationships, the brain doesn't really care for what is really safe or unsafe. The brain cares for familiarity until that trauma is released. And once we've released that trauma to establish that safety at a core level, by really abandoning those destructive coping mechanisms, and like you said, OCD may not be perceived as something destructive, but when it really affects a person's productivity and their thriving, that's when it becomes destructive, you know? So I like how you've illustrated for us that trauma and its effects on the body are so vast, and we really need to educate ourselves more. Naira, we have time for one more question, and this is more of a personal question. You are one of the queens of many non-traditional modalities, and that's what I absolutely admire about you. Share with me what your favorite modality for healing is. I've come to you for TRE. You've done some acupressure on me. We've done a few coaching sessions here and there. And, between sessions, you've also just been an incredible pillar and just a rock. And what many people don't understand is that's the role of a coach. That's the role of a therapist. Even between sessions, we offer that emotional support to our clients 24 hours of the day. But in your personal opinion, what is your favorite modality? Where do you see the most change in your clients?
Look, in order to answer that question, I have to talk about what I do in my own private practice, right? So someone walks in, we try to establish the state of their nervous system. Mostly we try to do it naturally, right? So there's no tried and tested way of doing it. It's natural. You're scanning their faces, you looking at their body language. What you're trying to do, I mean, that's my nervous system in itself as a facilitator is trying to pick up on someone else's safety,
Responding to
right?
somebody else's,
And
yes.
you after continuous work on your own body and your own nervous system, you can actually get a sense of the person's safety. So you're looking for some sort of regulation in that person, right? So
Mm,
the purpose of my work is to teach regulation, but at the same time is also enabling the client to build their own regulatory capacity. So you
mm,
don't want a client in facilitation for years and years and years. You want to teach them to be able to regulate themselves once they leave your practice, right? So the baseline treatment of my practice is TRE, and that's the best treatment in my opinion to release any stored experience, right? But sometimes 1 in 10 people come in and they're not ready for, like, TRE is not exactly the starting point for them because they have very incredibly heightened nervous systems, right? And in those cases, I bring in body work treatment, fascia release treatment, physically and manually, like craniosacral therapy on the bed, EMMET technique, offering the brain and the nervous system some regulation. So you want that natural regulation to kick in before you can actually bring out the traumas and
Mm.
short events, right? So Emmett specifically for those kids close on the autistic spectrum, right? They're very, very heightened children. So you want them to settle first because it can be too much for them, right? And once they regulate, we then take them into the tremor process from there. Okay, so this is
Mm.
determined mostly by meeting the client, sitting with the person, picking up on clues, just kind of sensing the heightenedness in the system, right? And it's very instinctive in all TRE facilitators. It's something we have in common that you become very instinctive because of your own process that you've had, right? So when it comes to favorite modalities, what I do is I have a toolbox of different therapies, starting first with regulation and then into safety. And remember this, Johara, very important. The brain negotiates safety, right? Important to know that as much as we want to deal with our traumas, we want our habits, our patterns to be gone. The brain has used this heightenedness and these patterns for, I mean, for as long as we can remember, some of us for all of our lives, right? And perhaps, your whole life you've turned to this to feel safe. And by taking it away, can feel dangerous to the system. Okay.
Mm.
And what we do is I always say to my clients that as much as danger can feel safe to the system because it's been there perhaps your whole life.
Mm.
Safety
Familiar.
can initially feel dangerous to the system
Yes.
because it's so new, right? So
Yes.
that's why trauma release is a process. Okay, and this is the real world, Johara. We're not saying come to us, we'll fix you. We're
Mm.
saying allow me to work with you. Allow me to teach your nervous system to regulation, its own capacity for regulation, and to teach your brain to go into safety. And let's see where we go from there. Let's see what your own system is capable of doing. And that's basically where I would go with favorite modalities.
That is incredible. Thank you for your insights, Naira, and for your time. It's been an absolute delight. I can talk about the nervous system and the brain for hours and hours. It's one of my favorite topics to talk about. And more than that, more than just understanding and talking about the brain, it's about using and harnessing our brain's power and our nervous system's natural ability to self soothe. Once you've acquired these skills, to facilitate healing, because that's what we want to reach, a point of ultimate healing, inshallah. We know that this dunya is a place of trials and tests, and we will be tested. And ultimately, where we will reach that perfection is in Jannah, inshallah, and we pray for it. But until we get there, we need to take conscious action towards that health and that healing by using any modalities that resonate with the pain that we have experienced. So, Naira, I thank you sincerely for your time and for your insights and for allowing me to pick your beautiful brain today. We will speak
Thank you,
soon,
Johara.
inshallah.
Thank you for having me. Jazakallah khair.
Assalamu alaikum. We're going to go for a quick break, and when we come back, we are going to conclude on how to tend to our spiritual selves while we are looking at holistic well being, holistic care, and emotional care, and how to nurture the spiritual side of ourselves through our connection with the Quran, inshallah.